The axe came down hard, sinking deep into the oak trunk. Halvard fell to his knees, trembling hands covering eyes that bled. "Odin's ravens will come," he whispered between sobs. "They will come for the Jarl. I saw it. I saw it in the forest whispers." The guards held him tighter as the healer approached, a burning iron ready to complete the sentence. The thrall who heard the gods would be silenced forever. Thank you for joining this journey into the shadows of the Viking world. This channel is just beginning, and every single subscription means the world. It keeps this story alive and moving forward. If you find yourself drawn to these tales of struggle and fate, please consider subscribing. And while you're here, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Your support shapes the path ahead. Halvard's eyes fluttered open just before dawn, the chill of the early morning seeping through the thin walls of the stable where he had slept. The air was dense with moisture, thick fog curling around the wooden beams like restless spirits unwilling to rest. Each breath he took was cold and sharp, filling his lungs with the biting scent of damp earth mixed with the faint tang of stale hay. He lay still for a moment longer, the roughness of the straw scratching against his skin, his body aching as if the night's restless dreams had etched themselves into his muscles. He was 23 winters old, though the years had not been kind. His frame was lean, almost gaunt, the muscles beneath his skin taut from a lifetime of labor rather than battle. His hands, calloused and scarred, rested at his sides, trembling slightly despite the stillness of the stable. The faint glow of embers from the hearth in the great hall barely reached this far, but Halvard knew the day was breaking. Another day of servitude awaited him, another day in the shadow of Jarl Thorsten Haraldsson. The stable was a place of solitude, where the thralls were banished to the fringes of the settlement, out of sight, out of mind. The scent of livestock was thick here, wet hides, the metallic tang of animal sweat, and the sharpness of fresh dung mingled in the cold air. Halvard's rough tunic, made of coarse linen faded from many washings, clung to his thin torso, damp with dew that had seeped through the cracks in the wooden walls. His woolen trousers bore patches from countless repairs, each stitch a silent testament to the thrall's existence, seen but not valued. Outside, the world was still shrouded in mist, the forest bordering the village wrapped in a veil of pale gray. The trees stood like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches scratching at the sky as if trying to tear the clouds apart. The scent of pine and damp moss mingled with the faint smoke drifting from the Jarl's longhouse chimney, a reminder of the heat and life that thrived beyond his reach. The village was waking slowly, the faint clang of metal, the distant barking of dogs, and the low murmur of voices began to rise on the chill wind. Halvard forced himself to rise. Each movement was a reminder of the punishments endured, the lingering sting of lash marks on his back, the ache in his knees from years spent kneeling before those who owned him. His hair, long and unkempt, hung in tangled strands around his face, the dark brown locks dusted with the flecks of straw from his bed. His skin, pale and marked by scars, bore the stories of his captivity, but his green eyes, the deep, mossy green of the northern forests, held a quiet resilience. He moved silently toward the stable door, careful not to disturb the other thralls still wrapped in the fragile cocoon of sleep. The flicker of torchlight from a passing guard cast elongated shadows through the fog, painting the wooden walls with shifting patterns of light and dark. Halvard stepped out into the morning, the cold air biting at his exposed skin. His breath came out in small clouds, vanishing quickly into the mist. The settlement lay in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by the dense forest that had once been his home. Now, those trees were a cage, a barrier between the life he had known and the chains he endured. The ground beneath his feet was soft with dew, the earth cool and damp, the smell of crushed leaves and pine needles rising with every step. The hum of insects was absent in the morning chill, replaced by the low whisper of wind through the branches. Halvard's daily tasks were simple but unending. Feed the animals, chop wood, carry water from the well, clean the longhouse floors. Endless work that left no room for rest or dreams. His position as thrall meant he was invisible to most, a shadow among the free men and women of the clan. The thralls were the backbone of the settlement, yet treated like possessions, tools to be used and discarded. He made his way toward the well, the wooden bucket dangling from a thick rope. The cold water was a brief comfort, the touch of it against his skin a small blessing amid the harshness of his world. As he drew the bucket up, the muscles in his arms tensed, veins standing out beneath the surface of his skin. The water shimmered in the feeble light, rippling gently as he lowered it back down. Nearby, the longhouse loomed, a massive structure built of timber and stone, its walls adorned with shields and the carved faces of ancient gods. Smoke coiled from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of roasting meat and burning wood. Inside, Jarl Thorsten Haraldsson held court, surrounded by his warriors and guests. The Jarl's presence was a constant weight, his sharp eyes like hawks watching over his domain. Halvard's mind drifted to the man who ruled him, the Jarl with cold blue eyes and a face carved by war. Thorsten was a man both feared and respected, his voice carrying the authority of the gods themselves. His cloak of bear fur swayed with every measured step, the golden bracelet on his arm glinting even in the dim light. The stories told around the fire spoke of his many battles, his victories, and his ruthless command. To speak against him was to invite death. But Halvard did not think of death. Not yet. His thoughts were tangled with memories of a life before captivity, fields that stretched beyond the forests, the laughter of kin, the scent of wildflowers on the breeze. Those days, distant as the stars, flickered in his mind like a fragile flame. They reminded him of who he once was and who he might yet become. Halvard, a gruff voice broke his reverie. Gorm Skullcrusher, the red-haired overseer of the thralls, stood nearby, his bulk casting a shadow over the small man. His face was harsh, marked by a lifetime of violence, his eyes narrow and unforgiving. The whip hanging from his belt was a constant reminder of his power. "Come," Gorm commanded, his tone sharp and impatient. "The Jarl needs firewood for his guests. You will fetch 2 bundles from the forest. Do not return without them." Halvard nodded silently, accepting the crude axe handed to him. The handle was worn smooth from use, the blade nicked but sharp. It was unusual to be given a weapon, even one meant for labor, but Halvard had never shown defiance. His submission was not born of fear, but of patience, a quiet waiting for a moment that had not yet come. He turned toward the edge of the village, where the trees awaited like an ancient army. The forest was both a prison and a refuge. Here, the sounds of the settlement faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves, the distant calling of birds, and the whisper of the wind weaving through the branches. The scent of pine needles and moist earth grew stronger, filling his nostrils with the familiar, grounding smell of the wild. Halvard moved deeper among the trees, the soft moss underfoot muffling his steps. The forest was alive, alive with secrets and spirits. The light filtered through the canopy in dappled patches, casting shifting shadows that danced on the trunks. He paused often, listening to the subtle symphony of life, the crack of a twig, the distant cry of a raven, the whisper of branches swaying. As he worked, chopping wood with steady, practiced strokes, his thoughts drifted once again. The forest was his only sanctuary from the harshness of the village, a place where the gods might still speak to those who dared listen. He had heard stories, tales of seers and prophets chosen by the divine to deliver messages that shaped the fate of clans. The day wore on, the sun climbing higher as Halvard continued his task. Sweat dampened his brow, mingling with the grime of labor. His arms ached, muscles burning with effort. Yet there was a strange calm in the rhythm of his work, the rise and fall of the axe. The Jarl would fall. The corvids of Odin would come. Halvard rose slowly, the axe slipping from his grasp. The forest held its secrets close, but now he carried one that could not be silenced. He gathered the last of the firewood and made his way back to the edge of the village, the weight of the prophecy pressing down with every step. The mist had begun to lift, revealing the settlement bathed in the pale light of morning. The sounds of life resumed, the clatter of footsteps, the murmur of voices, the clink of metal on wood. Inside the longhouse, the Jarl entertained his guests, unaware of the fate that had been spoken in the shadows of the forest. Halvard's eyes found the man's familiar silhouette, standing tall and proud with his golden bracelet catching the light. The words trembled on Halvard's lips, a burden too great to bear in silence. As he poured mead into the cups of the warriors, his gaze did not waver from Thorsten. The room buzzed with the warmth of fire and conversation, the scent of roasted meat thick in the air. Yet beneath the revelry lay a tension, a fragile thread that Halvard could feel tightening. Runa, the elder thrall who had watched over him since his arrival, noticed his unrest. Her worn eyes met his, a silent warning passing between them. "Do not speak of such things," she murmured, her voice low and trembling with age. "The Jarl does not suffer fools lightly." But the words had already escaped. "He will die," Halvard whispered, the weight of the vision heavy in his tone. "The corvids will come." The room shifted. Runa's face paled, and those around them stiffened. The youngest daughter of the Jarl, Svanhild, passed near them, her wide blue eyes locking onto Halvard's for a brief moment before she fled to her father's side. The Jarl's gaze turned to Halvard, sharp and cold. The moment of reckoning had begun. Inside the longhouse, the firelight flickered against carved beams and shields, casting long shadows that seemed to twitch with every sharp word spoken. Thorsten's voice was calm but laced with an unmistakable threat, filling the space with the power of command. The hall grew quiet, the warriors and guests watching as the man who had been invisible now stood at the center of their world. Halvard's heart beat fiercely beneath his rough tunic, the prophecy burning bright and dangerous. The gods had spoken, and the thrall had heard. The forest held its breath, waiting for what was to come. The heavy timber walls of the longhouse echoed with murmurs and shifting glances. The fire's flickering glow cast grotesque shadows that danced along the carved beams, mirroring the unease rippling through the hall. Halvard stood at the center, his hands still trembling from the weight of his own whispered prophecy. The eyes of warriors, guests, and servants alike bore into him with suspicion, contempt, and a cold curiosity he had never before experienced so keenly. Yet amid the oppressive atmosphere, a sudden commotion near the far corner of the hall shattered the fragile quiet. A soft, desperate sobbing rose above the low din, a sound so fragile and out of place that it drew Halvard's attention like a beacon in a storm. His eyes scanned the room, tracing the source of the noise. There, pressed against the shadowed wall, sat a girl no older than 10 winters. Her hair, a tangled mess of dark curls, was matted with dirt and sweat. Her small frame was draped in a threadbare cloak, too large and worn, falling about her like a tattered shroud. Her eyes, wide and fearful, darted from one stern face to another, seeking refuge in a sea of cold indifference. She was a thrall, like Halvard once was, or perhaps still was, but here, she was more vulnerable than most. The girl trembled, her body racked with silent sobs that spoke of unspeakable pain. A cruel laugh from Gorm's skullcrusher cut through the tension, his voice rough and mocking. "What's the matter with the runt? Afraid of the Jarl's wrath, perhaps? Or just a pitiful stray who should have been tossed to the wolves long ago?" The girl flinched but did not answer. Halvard's breath caught in his throat. The sight of her stirred something deep inside, a fragile ember of compassion, long buried beneath years of hardship and silence. No one else seemed to notice the sharp intake of breath that escaped him, or the tightening in his chest that felt like a silent plea for justice. Yet, in that moment, Halvard faced a choice far greater than any he had made before. To intervene meant risking the fragile thread of his own survival. To turn away would be to betray a part of himself he hadn't yet fully understood. The girl's name was whispered by a trembling slave woman standing near the hearth. Elsa, a name that carried with it stories of loss and abandonment. Her parents taken in a rival raid, her future uncertain and bleak. Halvard's mind raced. The Jarl's wrath was swift and merciless, especially for those who dared defy his will or disrupt the order of the settlement. To protect a child in such peril was to invite suspicion, punishment, perhaps death. Yet the forest's prophecy echoed in his mind, intertwining with the image of the frightened girl, the corvids descending not just upon the Jarl, but upon all who clung to cruelty and injustice. He stepped forward, his voice barely more than a whisper, yet steady with a newfound resolve. You cannot leave her like this. She will freeze before the gods, before the dawn. Gorm's eyes narrowed, and the cruel smile faded from his face. And who are you to speak for the Jarl's will, Thrall? You're little more than a dog beneath his boot. The hall fell into a tense silence. All eyes shifted between the two men, waiting to see whether Halvard would back down or press his claim. Halvard swallowed the lump in his throat. I am no one to challenge my lord openly, but even the lowliest among us deserve protection. The gods watch us all. The words hung in the air, charged with courage born not of defiance, but of empathy, a rare and dangerous light in a place ruled by fear. Runa, standing quietly nearby, gave him a subtle nod of encouragement, her weathered face softening with understanding. Yet even she knew the cost of such a choice. Gorm's laughter broke the silence like a whip crack. Then you will fetch her to the stables. There, she will stay until the Jarl decides her fate. His voice was laced with menace, a clear warning veiled beneath orders. And you, watch your tongue, Thrall. No more talk of gods or prophecies. Halvard's pulse thundered in his ears as he moved toward the trembling girl. Her eyes met his, flickers of hope struggling to ignite amid the fear. He reached out, his rough hands steadying her fragile frame. Come, he said softly. I will not let them silence your voice. The cold stone floor of the longhouse gave way to the chill of the outside air as Halvard led Elsa through the heavy wooden door. The night was thick with mist, the moon hidden behind rolling clouds that muted the stars to mere whispers against the dark sky. The scent of pine and damp earth embraced them, a stark contrast to the warmth and oppression inside. The stillness of the forest pressed around them, the silence broken only by the soft rustle of leaves beneath their feet. Halvard felt the weight of every glance from those who watched them depart, suspicion and scorn mingling with unease. Yet for the first time since the prophecy had gripped his soul, he felt a spark of purpose, an unspoken promise to protect what little innocence still flickered in such a harsh world. As they approached the stables, the faint whinny of horses and the low murmur of animals greeted them. The wooden structure stood like a silent sentinel, its rough-hewn beams weathered by years of storms and snow. Inside, the faint smell of hay and animal musk mingled with the cold. Halvard settled Elsa onto a pile of straw, wrapping his own coarse cloak around her shoulders. Her small hands clutched at the fabric, trembling less now with the warmth and the quiet strength she sensed in him. Why did you help me? Elsa's voice was barely audible, fragile as a breeze. Halvard's green eyes met hers, steady and honest. Because no one should face the night alone. The weight of his words lingered between them, sealing a bond forged not from blood, but from shared hardship and the fragile hope for a better dawn. Yet even in this brief moment of respite, the shadow of the Jarl loomed large. Halvard knew the wheels of fate had already begun to turn, and the price of mercy might yet demand a sacrifice neither of them could foresee. As the night deepened, Halvard sat sentinel beside the girl, the forest whispering its ancient secrets around them. Elsa sat huddled near the hearth, her knees drawn close to her chest beneath the thin cloak that Halvard had wrapped around her. Her breath came in shallow gusts, visible in the cold air, and her pale hands trembled as they clutched a small, worn doll, its fabric faded, one eye missing. The doll was a silent witness to her story, a talisman kept close in moments of fear and loneliness. Halvard placed a rough bowl of warm broth before her, the steam curling upward like a promise of comfort. His own hands were steady despite the lingering chill that crept through his bones. He watched as Elsa's eyes, wide and uncertain, flickered toward the food. Hunger warred with caution, but eventually the girl lowered her hands, lifting the bowl slowly to her lips. The first few sips were tentative, as if the warmth might burn or the taste betray some hidden danger. But as the broth soothed the ache within, her body relaxed bit by bit, the tight lines of fear softening. Halvard settled nearby, his own meal a simple offering of dried fish wrapped in coarse cloth, eaten in quiet companionship. The hut smelled of smoke and pine, mingling with the faint scent of herbs Halvard had gathered during their flight. The rough wooden walls were bare save for a few bent nails and a faded tapestry that hung unevenly, its colors muted by years of sun and rain. Outside, the forest stood silent, the night a thick blackness pierced only by the occasional flicker of a distant star. There was a fragile stillness between them, filled not by words, but by the unspoken understanding of shared exile. Halvard's eyes, deep green and steady, met Elsa's briefly, seeking to assure her without the need for promises he could not guarantee. The girl's gaze dropped shyly, fingers tracing the worn stitches of her doll's tattered dress. Time slipped by in small moments. The slow crackle of embers, the sigh of the wind beyond the door, the faint creak of wood settling. Halvard's hands moved with practiced care, pulling a threadbare blanket over Elsa's thin shoulders, adjusting the fire's embers to coax out more warmth. In the quiet, Elsa finally spoke, a voice fragile but steady, tinged with an accent unfamiliar to the rough northern tones of the settlement. "Thank you," she whispered, her blue eyes searching his face for a hint of kindness. Halvard nodded, his own voice low and rough like gravel. "You are safe now." Her eyes flickered down to the amulet hidden beneath her cloak, a small carved bone, etched with symbols alien to Halvard's own rune-filled world. It was a remnant of a past life, a secret kept close. He recognized the care with which she touched it, a silent prayer or a shield against the darkness that chased her. As the night deepened, Halvard set to work with the few supplies he had stolen from the longhouse. Scraps of linen to clean a shallow wound on Elsa's arm. A small vial of salve passed between his fingers with hesitant reverence. The injury was old but tender, a mark of escape or punishment. His touch was gentle, a quiet defiance against the harshness they both had known. Elsa flinched at first, but did not pull away. Instead, she offered him a small, grateful smile, a flicker of warmth in a world so often cold and cruel. In that moment, something shifted between them, a fragile trust, a shared understanding born not of words, but of survival. The firelight danced across their faces, illuminating the lines of weariness and hope. Halvard's eyes traced the delicate curve of Elsa's cheek, the shadowed hollows beneath her eyes where sleepless nights had left their mark. She caught his gaze and held it, unafraid. There was a quiet strength there, hidden beneath the fragility. Outside, the wind whispered again, carrying with it the distant call of ravens, a haunting reminder of the prophecy that bound their fates. But within the small hut, the world narrowed to the flickering fire, the steady presence of another soul seeking shelter. Halvard reached into his worn leather pouch and pulled out a small piece of bread. He broke it carefully, offering half to Elsa. She took it with trembling fingers, the simple act a bridge across the gulf of their separate pasts. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sound the low crackling of the fire and the steady rhythm of their breathing. The night stretched on, a fragile cocoon against the storm gathering beyond the walls. In the quiet, Halvard's mind wandered to the ancient stories whispered in the shadows of the forest, tales of gods and men, of fate and honor, of voices heard and silenced. He wondered what path lay ahead, what price they would pay for the truth he carried. But for now, in this small refuge, there was only the moment, a fleeting peace born of shared hardship and the unspoken promise to protect what little light remained. Elsa's eyelids grew heavy, the warmth seeping into her bones, softening the sharp edges of fear. Halvard watched over her, vigilant and silent, the weight of the world pressing down, but never breaking the fragile bond forged in the heart of the night. Outside, the forest held its breath. The gods were watching. The silence that had settled over the small forest refuge was fragile, like the thin crust of ice that forms over a dark, deep river. Halvard sat near the dying embers of the fire, his eyes fixed on the shadows dancing along the rough wooden walls. Elsa slept peacefully, her small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of breath, a softness in this harsh world. But beyond the shelter of the hut, the winds carried change, unseen, but gathering strength like a storm on the horizon. News traveled swiftly in the Viking world, carried by whispers, rumors, and the keen ears of those who lived for tales of power and betrayal. The disappearance of Halvard, once a thrall bound to the Jarl Thorsten's will, was no secret for long. Gorm Skullcrusher, the brutal overseer, had reported the empty stable and the absence of the girl Elsa with a mixture of fury and disbelief. The Jarl's household stirred uneasily as the truth bloomed like a wound beneath their feet. Within the longhouse, the Jarl's voice cut through the murmurs and shifting glances. "They have fled," Thorsten Haraldsson declared, pacing with an impatience that betrayed his usual cold composure. His eyes, sharp and relentless, burned with the fire of a man who did not tolerate defiance. The thrall and the girl, traitors in our midst. The warriors exchanged uneasy looks. The Jarl's wrath was legendary, and his command was law. To harbor a fugitive, especially one who bore the stain of prophecy, was to invite doom. Yet the question lingered. Where would such outcasts vanish in the endless dark forest? And who might aid them in a land ruled by fear and suspicion? Outside the village, the forest shifted, alive with eyes and voices that did not belong to men alone. Hunters and scouts from neighboring clans caught wind of the escape, like carrion birds drawn to a fresh kill. Stories traveled quickly. Halvard, the thrall who heard the gods, and the Jarl's daughter's thrall, Elsa, vanished into the wilds. Some saw it as a curse. Others whispered of rebellion, magic, and the wrath of the gods. Runa, the elder thrall who had aided Halvard, moved cautiously through the settlement, her steps light but purposeful. Her aged eyes, once filled with sorrow, now carried the burden of urgent knowledge. She knew the dangers that awaited them. The Jarl's spies would scour every corner, every shadow. The forest would not keep secrets for long. In the dim light of the early morning, voices rose in the longhouse courtyard. Villagers gathered, their faces a mix of fear, curiosity, and resentment. Some blamed Halvard for bringing misfortune, others feared the Jarl's retribution. The fragile order of the settlement trembled beneath the weight of suspicion. One of the traders from a nearby clan arrived unexpectedly, riding hard through the muddy paths. His news spread like wildfire. Rival clans had heard of the Jarl's troubles. Word was reaching ears that thirsted for power, for opportunity. The Jarl's enemies would see weakness and act swiftly. Inside the longhouse, the Jarl's gaze darkened. "We cannot allow this betrayal to spread. Find them. Bring them back, dead or alive." Let all who would challenge my rule learn the price of defiance. The command was absolute, a decree that rippled through the settlement like a plague. Gorm Skullcrusher rallied a group of warriors. The weight of his prophecy bore heavily on him. The words of the gods were no longer distant whispers, but a burning fire in his veins. He understood the peril of his vision, that the Jarl's death was not just fate, but a spark that could ignite chaos across the clans. And with such knowledge came responsibility. Elsa, despite her youth, showed resilience that belied her fragile form. She gathered roots and herbs under Runa's guidance, learning the silent language of the woods. Her blue eyes held questions and a burgeoning courage that seemed to bloom in the shadow of their flight. Halvard saw in her a reflection of his own hidden strength, a spark that might yet kindle a flame of change. But the forest was not the only force closing in. Within the village, whispers grew louder. Some feared that harboring Halvard and Elsa was a sign of rebellion among the thralls, that the fragile balance of power might shift. Tensions rose, and old resentments simmered until they threatened to boil over. Gorm Skullcrusher's fury became a spark in this tinderbox. His rough voice stirred the crowd, his accusations sharp and venomous. They bring the gods' madness to our doorstep. If we do not act, if the Jarl's word is not upheld, our very lives are at risk. Fear and anger wove through the village like wildfire. The settlers, hardened by years of conflict and hardship, looked to the Jarl for protection and reassurance. But even Thorsten Haraldsson carried the weight of uncertainty. His confidence was a mask, worn thin by the knowledge that forces beyond mere men were at play. In the dim corners of the longhouse, Valen the healer observed the growing unrest with a conflicted heart. His blue eyes, clouded with age and wisdom, saw the threads of fate pulling tighter. The prophecy, once a whispered secret, was now a tempest gathering strength. He wondered if the gods had truly chosen Halvard, or if the thrall was but a pawn in a greater game. One evening, under a sky heavy with clouds and the promise of rain, the search parties returned empty-handed but not defeated. Their faces were grim, their spirits restless. The forest had swallowed its secrets once more, leaving the Jarl's men with only frustration and fear. Thorsten's voice was low and cold as he addressed his warriors. They are out there still. The gods may have whispered to the thrall, but we are Vikings. Our strength lies not in prophecy, but in steel and will. Yet even as he spoke, a flicker of unease crossed his face. The ravens had been silent for days, but the gods' messengers were patient, and their time would come. In the village, suspicion turned inward. The thralls whispered among themselves, sharing hushed conversations and guarded glances. Loyalty was fragile, and fear a constant companion. Some wondered if Runa's aid to Halvard was an act of defiance. Others feared the consequences of harboring a man marked by fate. Halvard understood the danger, that each day brought them closer to discovery, and the fragile bonds of trust could shatter under pressure. Yet his resolve did not waver. The prophecy was a flame that could not be extinguished, and the voices in the woods called him onward. One night, as the wind howled through the ancient pines, a scout from a neighboring clan arrived at the settlement's edge. His arrival was sudden, his message urgent. Rival clans were mobilizing, sensing weakness in the Jarl's hold. The coming days would be fraught with war and treachery. The Jarl's face darkened, the golden bracelet on his arm catching the torchlight like a beacon of command. Our enemies gather, he said. The prophecy may be a curse or a warning, but we will meet it with fire and sword. Halvard felt the weight of the moment. The gods' will, the clan's ambitions, the fragile future of those he cared for, all converged on a knife's edge. To protect Elsa and others like her meant standing against not only men, but the relentless tide of fate. Runa's voice broke his thoughts, steady and resolute. We must move. The forest can no longer shield us. The whispers speak of others, those who hear as you do. They wait beyond the mountains. The choice was clear but perilous. To flee was to embrace the unknown. To stay was to face certain doom. With the first light of dawn, Halvard gathered what little they could carry. The forest behind them was dark and silent, as if mourning the loss of its secrets. Ahead lay a path fraught with danger, but also hope, the call of the gods echoing in his soul. As they slipped into the shadows, the settlement awoke to rumors of flight and defiance. The Jarl's anger was a storm on the rise, but so too was the promise of a new destiny. The forest held its breath. The world watched. The gods waited. The forest had never felt so suffocating. The ancient trees, once silent allies, now towered ominously, their shadows twisting like serpents beneath a bitter sky heavy with darkening clouds. Halvard's breath came in ragged bursts, each exhale a mist that vanished quickly into the cold air. He moved with cautious urgency, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his worn boots barely audible over the distant murmur of voices, a sound that gnawed at the fragile hope he and Runa had clung to since their flight. They were not alone anymore. Gorm's Skullcrusher's hunt had grown relentless, his fury a wildfire that consumed every whispered lead. The Jarl's command was clear, merciless, a chase that would brook no mercy, no hesitation. Every footfall behind them was a reminder of the chains Halvard had left behind, the shackles of servitude tightening not on his wrists, but around his very soul. Elsa, her small hand trembling in his, glanced up with wide eyes that held both fear and a growing, stubborn resolve. The girl who had once cowered beneath the weight of despair now stood with a quiet strength, a flicker of defiance simmering beneath her pale skin. The wound on her arm, though slowly healing, ached with each step, but she refused to slow, refusing to be left behind. Runa led the way, her steps sure despite the years etched into her body. Her eyes, sharp as hawks, scanned every shadow, every break in the underbrush. The old thrall's knowledge of the forest was their shield, a fragile line between life and death. Yet even she could not mask the growing tension that gripped them all. The Jarl's men are close, Runa whispered, her voice a thread barely carried on the wind. They will be upon us before night falls. Halvard's green eyes narrowed, the weight of the prophecy settling heavier in his chest. 3 days. The time was almost spent. The god's message was no longer distant. It was a ticking drumbeat in his veins. The blood of the tyrant, Thorsten Haraldsson, would soon nourish the roots of Yggdrasil. Yet how? By whose hand? The question twisted in his mind like a knife. A rustle to their left drew their attention. Halvard's hand instinctively reached for the crude axe at his belt, the only weapon he carried beyond his bare hands. From the undergrowth emerged a group of warriors, faces painted with grim determination, weapons raised high. Gorm's Skullcrusher at their lead, a bloodthirsty glare burning in his eyes. So, the thrall dares to hide like a rat in the woods, Gorm snarled, stepping forward with a cruel smile that twisted his scarred face. And the little runt with him. You think the gods will save you now? Halvard stepped protectively in front of Elsa, his posture unyielding despite the odds. His voice was low, steady but fierce. We fear no man's wrath, but the will of the gods. Leave us, and you may yet live. The warriors laughed, a harsh, mirthless sound that echoed through the trees. Gorm's grip tightened on his axe. You speak boldly for a slave. The Jarl will have his justice. Before the hunters could advance, a sudden gust swept through the branches, scattering leaves like fleeting specters. From the canopy above, a sound arose, deep, guttural caws that sliced through the tension. Ravens, black as the void, descended in a swirling cloud, their wings beating a chaotic rhythm against the cold air. The warriors faltered, shields raised instinctively against the onslaught of feathers and claws. Gorm cursed, swinging his axe wildly, but the birds were relentless. Their cries seemed to carry the voices of the gods themselves, a herald of doom. In the chaos, Halvard seized the moment. Grabbing Elsa's hand, he darted into a narrow path known only to Runa and those who had listened to the forest's wit. Runa's voice broke the silence, gravelly and wise. The time is near. The Jarl will come for us soon, and this night may be your last chance to speak your truth. Halvard tightened his grip on the small wooden amulet Runa had given him, a carved figure of Mimir's head, a symbol of wisdom and sacrifice. It was a talisman against the darkness that sought to swallow them whole. Before dawn, the sounds arrived, footsteps heavy on frozen ground, the clash of iron on stone as the Jarl's warriors encircled the grove. At their head strode Thorsten Haraldsson himself, his presence as commanding as the legends foretold. The golden bracelet on his arm gleamed faintly in the moonlight, a symbol of power and unyielding authority. His eyes, cold and piercing, locked on a Halvard with a mixture of contempt and curiosity. So, the thrall who hears the gods dares to hide and defy me, he said, voice low and dangerous. You will answer for this treason. Halvard rose slowly, his shoulders squared despite the weight of chains still binding his past. I answer only to the gods, Jarl. Their voice has chosen me to bear a message, a warning you have refused to hear. Thorsten's lips curled into a bitter smile. Prophecies are for fools and madmen. It is steel that commands respect in these lands. But the gods have spoken, Halvard insisted, voice ringing through the cold air. Their message is clear. The tyrant's blood will feed the roots of the world tree. Your reign ends, Thorsten Haraldsson. The Jarl's warriors shifted uneasily, some exchanging wary glances. The old fear of divine wrath flickered in their eyes, battling with loyalty to their leader. Thorsten stepped closer, his breath visible in the chill night air. If the gods wish me dead, then let them come for me. But it will not be by the hands of a thrall. With that, the Jarl raised his sword, its amber hilt catching the faint light like a blaze. The moment hung suspended, breathless and precarious, as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon. A sudden cry shattered the stillness. From the trees emerged a figure cloaked in shadow, a wildness in his eyes that matched the fury of the forest itself. It was Eirik, a warrior from a neighboring clan known for his defiance and cunning. He had heard whispers of Halvard's plight and journeyed to stand beside the thrall. I stand with him, Eirik declared, voice echoing through the grove. No man, no Jarl, owns the will of the gods. The warriors murmured, the tide of doubt shifting. The Jarl's grip on his men wavered, the prophecy's shadow creeping across the hearts of those who had once followed him without question. Thorsten's face hardened, the glint of rage returning. But before he could strike, the sky above erupted in a cacophony of wings. Hundreds of ravens descended once more, their cries piercing the dawn, an undeniable sign that the gods favored the thrall's cause. The warriors faltered, shields raised against the assault, the power of the omen undeniable. Thorsten's expression twisted from anger to fear, the man who had seemed invincible now revealed as mortal and vulnerable. Halvard stepped forward, voice steady and commanding. See the truth in their eyes. The gods speak through the forest, through the ravens. Your time is over. The Jarl's sword lowered slowly, the weight of prophecy crushing the iron will that had ruled so long. In that moment, the balance of power shifted, not with the clash of steel, but with the undeniable voice of the divine. Silence settled over the grove as the ravens circled, their wings blotting out the sun. The thrall who had been silenced, beaten, and broken now stood as the bearer of truth, his words a beacon in the darkness of tyranny. Thorsten Haraldsson, once the unchallenged master of the clan, knelt amidst the fallen leaves, his reign undone not by rebellion of men, but by the inexorable will of the gods. Halvard looked to Elsa, to Runa, to the faces of those who dared to believe. The path ahead would be fraught with hardship, but the chains of silence were shattered. The voices of the gods would not be silenced. And in that sacred dawn, a new chapter began for the North, one where even the humblest could carry the power of fate itself. The first light of dawn filtered softly through the thick canopy, casting a pale glow over the quiet forest clearing where Halvard, Elsa, and Runa had taken refuge. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, a fragile calm after the storm of shadows and steel that had chased them for days. Yet beneath the peace, a subtle tension lingered, an unease born not of fear alone, but of the uncertain promise that had begun to weave itself into the tapestry of their lives. Halvard sat cross-legged on a bed of moss, the rough texture pressing against his worn trousers, grounding him in the moment. His fingers absently traced the carved wooden amulet resting on his chest, a talisman of wisdom and sacrifice gifted by Runa. The symbol of Mimir's head seemed to pulse faintly with an ancient power, as if the very earth beneath them recognized its bearer. Elsa stirred beside him, her pale face framed by tangled platinum strands that caught the morning light. She blinked slowly, her blue eyes wide and clear, carrying the quiet resilience that had blossomed despite all they had endured. Runa, her frame bent with age but steady, sat nearby tending a small fire, its smoke curling upwards and mingling with the fragile dawn mist. For a long moment, none spoke. Words felt heavy in the air, laden with the weight of what had passed and the uncertain road ahead. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Finally, Elsa broke the silence, her voice soft and tentative. "Halvard, you saved me. You risked everything." "What?" Halvard met her gaze, his deep green eyes steady and warm. The lines of hardship were etched across his face, but beneath them lay a quiet dignity that no chain could break. "Because no one should face the dark alone," he said simply. "Not even a thrall. Not even a girl with the weight of the world on her shoulders." She looked down, fingers tightening around the edge of her cloak. "I never thought anyone would care." "Many do not," Halvard murmured, "but some must. Even in a world built on fear and cruelty, mercy can shine like a blade." Runa glanced up from the fire, her weathered face softening. "It is not mercy alone that guides us, child," she said. "It is truth." Halvard carries the god's message, and with it, the hope for change. Halvard's jaw tightened. Hope is a fragile thing, easy to crush beneath the boots of men like Thorsten, but it is all we have left. The memory of Jarl Thorsten Haraldsson lingered heavy in the clearing, his cold blue eyes, the cruel lines of his face, the iron grip he had wielded over their lives. The prophecy had been a weight that threatened to shatter Halvard, yet it had also fueled a fire within his soul, a fire that now burned brighter than ever. Elsa's gaze lifted, her voice firm despite her youth. "The Jarl, he was cruel, but he was also afraid. Fear is the shadow that rules many men," Halvard agreed. "It twists their hearts, makes monsters of them. Thorsten's reign came from fear, of losing power, of death, of the gods' judgment." Runa nodded slowly. "And the gods have spoken through Halvard. Their voice is not just a warning. It is a call to all who suffer under tyranny." A soft wind stirred the branches overhead, carrying with it the distant, haunting caw of ravens, Odin's messengers, the silent witnesses to the unfolding fate. The sound felt like a benediction, a reminder that the divine had not abandoned them. Halvard rose to his feet, his posture weary yet resolute. "We cannot stay here. The Jarl's reach is long, and his wrath unyielding. But we have allies, others who hear the gods' whispers. They wait beyond the mountains, where the world is wide and free." Elsa struggled unsteadily to stand, her arms still aching but her spirit unbroken. "Will they accept us? Will they understand?" "They must," Runa said firmly. "For if they do not, the gods' message will be lost, and with it, the chance for a new beginning." Halvard looked toward the east, where the pale light promised the coming day. We carry more than our own lives now. We carry the hopes of many. The path will be hard, but I will not falter. Not while there are those who believe. The three gathered their meager belongings, the few supplies stolen or salvaged during their flight. Yet within the harshness of the wilderness, something new began to grow. The bond between Halvard, Elsa, and Runa deepened, a fragile family forged in fire and flight. Elsa's laughter, rare and precious, began to break through the gloom, a reminder that even in the darkest chapters, light could find a way. One evening, as they rested beside a quiet stream, Runa shared stories from her past, tales of distant lands and lost tribes, of gods who walked among men and whispered secrets to those brave enough to listen. Her voice was rough but filled with reverence, weaving a tapestry of myth and memory that wrapped around them like a shield. Many have felt the gods' call, she said softly. Not all hear it clearly. Some are chosen to carry burdens that would break lesser souls, and some, like you, Halvard, are chosen to be the voice when others fall silent. Halvard listened, the firelight flickering in his eyes. The weight of destiny pressed upon him, but it no longer crushed. Instead, it gave him purpose, a reason to endure, to fight not with sword alone, but with the unyielding strength of truth. Elsa, nestled beside him, looked up with a tentative smile. Do you think the gods will forgive us? Halvard's gaze softened. Forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves. The gods watch all, but it is we who must choose the path. I believe they see our hearts, and that is enough. The night deepened, stars twinkling faintly through breaks in the canopy. Around them, the forest whispered its ancient secrets, the voices of the gods weaving through the rustling leaves. In that moment, Halvard felt the chains of his past fall away, not with the roar of battle or the clash of blades, but with the quiet strength of acceptance. He was no longer just a thrall, no longer merely a bearer of prophecy. He was a man who had chosen to stand for something greater than fear. Days later, as the mountains rose before them like jagged sentinels guarding the horizon, their small group encountered others, men and women who, like Halvard, heard the gods' voices in the wind and the woods. They were wanderers, exiles, and visionaries, bound not by birth but by belief. Among them, Halvard found kinship and purpose. The whispers of the gods were no longer isolated murmurs, but a chorus, a call to rise beyond chains and crowns, to build a future where the voiceless might speak and the humble might carry the power of destiny. One evening, gathered around a fire beneath an endless sky, Halvard looked to those who had become his new family. Their faces were etched with hardship and hope, each scar and smile a testament to survival. Runa's eyes met his, full of pride and quiet joy. You have come far, Thrall, more than most could bear. Halvard nodded. The journey is not over. But for the first time, I am free, not just in body, but in spirit. Elsa, now taller, stronger, stood at his side, her gaze shining with newfound courage. We will carry the gods' voice together. The ravens circled overhead, their cries a haunting melody that stirred the soul. The prophecy that had once seemed a curse was now a promise, a dawn breaking over darkened lands. Halvard closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath him, the breath of the gods in the wind. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril and sacrifice, but it was theirs to walk. And as the firelight danced across the faces of those who dared to believe, Halvard understood something profound. Even the smallest voice, when spoken with truth and courage, could shake the foundations of the world. The gods had spoken, and their message would not be silenced. In the heart of the wilderness, beneath the endless sky, a new chapter had begun. The seasons had shifted once more, and the northern winds carried a sharper edge, heralding the slow approach of winter. Yet beneath the frost-hardened ground, life pulsed quietly, resilient, enduring. The small village nestled in the shadow of towering pines and jagged mountains bore the marks of change, etched not in stone nor blood, but in the hearts and hands of its people. Where once fear had reigned like a dark storm over the settlement, now there was a fragile peace. The longhouse, still weathered and worn, stood fuller than before, its hearth alive with crackling flames that seemed to chase away more than just the cold. The walls echoed with voices, laughter tentative but genuine, and the weight of suspicion had given way to cautious trust. Halvard sat quietly near the fire, the warmth settling into his bones like a balm. His green eyes, once haunted by visions and chains, scanned the room, filled with faces both familiar and new. The scars on his skin remained, reminders of the past he could not forget, but his gaze held something different now, a steady calm born from survival and purpose. Around him, the villagers moved with renewed energy. Some worked at the forge, shaping iron with sparks flying like the fleeting flames of old grudges being purged. Others tended to the earth, hands deep in the dark soil, planting seeds that promised a future beyond mere survival. Children played near the edge of the forest, their laughter a fragile but defiant song rising against the quiet murmurs of the past. Runa stood nearby, her aged frame bent but dignified. Her gray hair, pulled back in the low knot she had worn for years, framed a face lined with both suffering and wisdom. She watched the scene with a soft smile, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight and the long journey that had brought them here. The elder Thrall's voice, though frail, carried the weight of countless winters. "We have come far from the shadows that once held us," she murmured, her gaze drifting to Halvard. "The god's voice is no longer whispered only in secret. It is woven into the very bones of this place." Halvard nodded, his hand brushing lightly over the wooden amulet resting against his chest, the carved head of Mimir, symbol of knowledge and sacrifice. "It is a new beginning," he said quietly, "but one that must be earned day by day, with each choice and each act of courage." The longhouse door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, breaking the gentle rhythm of the evening. A young man, clad in a worn cloak of deep green, carried the dust and scent of the wild in his every step. His eyes, sharp and alert, scanned the room before settling on Halvard. "I have traveled from beyond the mountains," the newcomer said, voice steady but filled with the weight of untold stories. "I have heard the calls of the gods and the tales of your flight. They say you carry their truth." Halvard rose to greet him, the years of exile and struggle folding into a moment of recognition. "Then you know why we left. The Jarl's shadow still lingers, and the path ahead is longer than the horizon." The man nodded, stepping closer. "I am Leif. I, too, have heard the voices. They have guided me here." Runa's eyes twinkled with a knowing light. "You are welcome among us, Leif. The god's message is greater than any one man or village. It is a flame meant to be shared." A hush settled over the gathering, a shared understanding rippling through the crowd. The arrival of another who heard the divine voices was a quiet reassurance, a sign that the old ways of silence and oppression were breaking. Elsa, now standing taller and more confident, stepped forward beside Halvard. Her blue eyes shone with a fierce determination that belied her youth. "We have been given a chance to build something different," she said softly. "Something that honors those who came before and protects those who will come after." The firelight caught the glint of a small carved bone amulet at her throat, a relic from her past, a link to a world both lost and reclaimed. In that moment, the distance between slave and free, prophecy and action, seemed to narrow. Outside, the wind carried the distant, haunting cries of ravens, Odin's messengers, circling above like unseen guardians. Their calls echoed a truth older than men and kingdoms, a reminder that the gods watched not with judgment, but with expectation. Days turned to weeks, and the rhythms of the village settled into a new cadence. The thralls who had once borne the weight of chains walked with heads held higher, their hands no longer trembling beneath the lash, but steady as they tended the fields and crafted their homes. The men and women who had been warriors now found themselves become protectors, not of tyranny, but of community. Their eyes met, a silent pact passing between them, a shared commitment to protect the fragile new world they had begun to build. From the shadows of the forest, a familiar figure emerged, Runa, leaning on her carved wooden staff. Her gaze swept the village below, where lights flickered through the growing night. "The gods are patient," she said, voice steady despite the frailty of age. "Their voices will continue to call, and we will answer, as long as there are those who listen." A breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it the soft rustle of wings. Ravens passed overhead, their black silhouettes cutting against the fading light. Their cries were no longer ominous warnings, but songs of resilience and hope. In the heart of the north, beneath the watchful eyes of the gods and the ancient trees, a new chapter was unfolding, not written in the blood of conquest, but in the quiet strength of those who dared to speak, to heal, and to believe. Halvard's hands closed around the carved amulet once more. The past still whispered in the scars on his skin and the memories in his mind. But now, the future sang louder. And in that song, the voices of the gods found their messenger again, not in chains, but in freedom. The night deepened, stars burning cold and distant overhead. But within the village, the flame of a new age flickered steady, an ember against the long shadow of the past, a promise born from silence and struggle. The gods had spoken, and their voice would never be silenced again. The night wrapped the village in a cold, silent cloak, the stars above distant and indifferent witnesses to the fragile peace that had been won. Within the walls of the longhouse, the fire's glow softened the hard edges of the room, casting a warm light upon faces marked by exhaustion and cautious hope. Halvard sat quietly, the carved amulet resting heavy against his chest, a constant reminder of the journey that had brought him from the depths of servitude to this moment of fragile freedom. The voices of the gods that once whispered only in secret now seemed to breathe through the breath of every living thing around him. The crackling flames, the sighing wind beyond the timbered walls, the steady heartbeat of a community reborn from its own ashes. He could still feel the weight of the prophecy, the knowledge that had almost cost him his sight, his life, yet had also set in motion a great shifting beneath the roots of his world. Elsa sat nearby, her youthful features softened by the firelight, but no less defined by determination. The girl who had once trembled beneath the shadow of fear had grown into a woman of quiet strength. Her hand rested on the simple wooden table, fingers tracing the worn edges as if grounding herself in the present, in the life they had clawed back from despair. Runa, ever watchful, leaned on her carved staff, her eyes reflecting the flickering light and the hard-won wisdom of many winters. She spoke softly, her voice carrying the weight of experience and the unyielding spirit of those who endure. "Change is never easy," she said. "Like the seasons, it comes slow and harsh, but it also brings new growth." Halvard looked up, meeting her gaze. The lines of hardship on her face told stories he had only begun to understand. The sacrifices, the betrayals, the moments when hope was all that stood between life and death. "We have been given a chance," he replied, voice steady despite the fatigue settling into his bones. "But the God's voice is a burden as much as a blessing. It demands more than courage. It demands sacrifice." Outside, the wind stirred again, carrying the faint, haunting calls of ravens, the ever-watchful messengers of Odin. Their cries seemed to echo through the night, a reminder that the divine was neither silent nor distant. The gods were present, watching, waiting, their will unfolding through the lives of those brave enough to listen. Halvard's thoughts drifted back to the path they had walked, the cold mornings in the stable, the terror of chains and lashes, the forest's whispered secrets, the moment when the prophecy had first shattered the fragile silence of his captivity. He remembered the hands that had bound him, the cold iron threatening to steal his sight, and the sudden chaotic storm of wings that had changed his fate. He thought of the Jarl, Thorsten Haraldsson, the man whose reign of iron had cast fear across the land, now fallen, his power broken not by sword but by the inexorable voice of the gods. The tyrant's fall was both an ending and a beginning, a rupture in the cycle of cruelty that had defined their world for too long. Elsa's voice broke the silence, soft yet firm. Do you think the gods will continue to speak through us? Through those who come after? Halvard met her gaze, the firelight catching the steady green of his eyes. They must, he answered. If their voice falls silent, then darkness returns. It is not enough to hear the gods. We must carry their message, live it, breathe it, even in the face of doubt and danger. Runa nodded. The gods test us not only with their words, but with the paths we choose. The strength of a people lies not in their swords alone, but in their hearts and their will to change. The village outside stirred gently, the faint murmur of voices, the soft footsteps of those who had once known only fear, but now dared to dream of freedom. Children laughed quietly in the distance, a sound fragile as a bird's wing beat, but powerful in its defiance. Halvard's gaze lingered on the faces around the hearth. Men and women who had suffered under chains, who had survived storms of cold and violence, who now looked toward a horizon not defined by conquest or subjugation, but by shared hope. It was a future uncertain and fraught with peril, yet for the first time, it felt possible. The fire's glow flickered, shadows dancing like ancient spirits among the timber beams. Halvard's voice was low, thoughtful. We are the voice now, not just for ourselves, but for those who cannot speak, for those who still suffer in silence. We carry the gods' will, and with it, the weight of all who come after. Elsa's hand found his, a brief touch that spoke of trust and unspoken promises. Then we must be ready, she said quietly, ready for whatever comes. Outside, the wind carried the raven's call once more, a haunting melody that seemed to weave through the night like a thread of fate. The gods were not idle. Their message had been heard, their will set in motion. The chains of the past were broken, but the path forward was an uncharted wilderness, one that would require every ounce of strength, wisdom, and courage they possessed. Halvard closed his eyes briefly, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath him, the quiet breath of the forest beyond. He knew the road ahead would be long and perilous. The shadows of old powers still lingered, and not all who held swords would welcome the change that was coming. But for the first time, he felt something that had been absent for so long: hope. A fragile, quiet hope that whispered like the wind through the ancient trees, a promise that even the smallest voice, spoken with truth and courage, could shake the foundations of the world. Outside, the ravens circled, their black wings blotting the stars. Their cries were no longer omens of doom but songs of resilience, carrying the god's voice into the coming dawn. And as the fire flickered low, Halvard knew the message was clear. The gods had spoken. Their voice would never be silenced. The night deepened, heavy with the ancient weight of fate and the fragile light of new beginnings. In the silence that followed, a question lingered, one that would echo through the ages. When the gods speak through the humblest among us, what will we choose to hear? What will we dare to do? Perhaps, in that choice, lies the true power of a Viking. If this journey into the shadows of fate and courage has stirred something within, consider joining the path ahead. Subscribe and walk with us through the stories yet to come, stories where the quiet voices grow loud, and the gods' whispers become the thunder of change. Because in the frozen lands of the north, under the watchful eyes of the gods and the ancient trees, Even the smallest light can ignite a fire that will not be easily extinguished.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.